This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 2.1 on the Federalist Era, which is going to run us roughly from the ratification of the Constitution in 1789 up until 1800. When Jefferson and the Republicans take over. And at the beginning here, I just want to, we're now entering our second epoch, which is going to run us roughly from 1789 in the Federalist Era all the way really through the Mexican Cession that follows the Mexican-American War in 1848. And what we're going to see here is ultimately that by the end of this second epoch, a civil war is all but inevitable. And we're going to see why that is, and what I want to kind of highlight here at the beginning are the major trends that we're going to look at over the next few weeks as we go through this epoch. And I'm just highlighting them here. We'll of course go into detail on them as we run along here. And the main political trend that we're going to look at is the gradual, and I've mentioned it before, is the gradual subordination of the states to national sovereignty. This will ultimately be the primary cause of the Civil War, and will be decided by force of arms in the war between the states. And we really see it at the Constitutional Convention. The rise of the nationalists in the 1780s is the driving force of this development of a supreme national government. And we'll see some details with that. We'll see the Judiciary Act in 1789, which actually establishes the authority of the Supreme Court. We'll see the difficulties involved with the United States in executing the War of 1812. We'll see the development of the national bank, which will give the central government control over the monetary system. We'll see the Missouri Compromise, which I mentioned in the previous lecture, which will establish the precedent of the national government having some influence over what goes into state constitutions. In McCulloch v. Maryland, we'll see the establishment of the right of the national government and the Supreme Court to do what primarily the Supreme Court is associated with now, which is judicial review. And we'll take a look at the nullification crisis in the 1830s, resulting from the Tariff of Abominations, in which the basic idea here is that the states under John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, enacts anyways, or adopts anyways, the idea that if national government policy contradicts state interests, the states can nullify the national government policy. And of course this won't work. The second major political trend that we're going to look at has to do with the polarization. And I've kind of briefly mentioned this before. What we see prior to any conflict is a polarization of interests. The interests gradually grow more and more distant from each other, and it largely divides itself into two or more camps. In this case, two camps in the United States. It will dichotomize the United States. First, we'll see the development of the party system and how this works. And you see down here, we'll have first the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists will ultimately, under Jefferson, evolve into the Republican Party. Then we'll see the Republicans and the National Republicans, and the National Republicans will really be the holdover of the Federalists. Then we'll see the Democrats versus the Whigs in this period. And we've already talked at some length about the debtors versus the creditors, which culminates in Shays' Rebellion. We'll also have, and we've already kind of looked at it, a regional polarization, principally between the southern states and the northern states. And this is one of the things we're going to talk about in this epoch and in the next one, is how over time the history of the United States prior to the Civil War degenerates into a conflict, a polarization between slavery and non-slavery. And this isn't entirely accurate. What you have is you have the southern states, and we'll look at this in detail later, but you have the southern states primarily advocating for states' rights, and the northern states primarily advocating for a strong national government. The northern states, in fact the New England states particularly, but the northern states in general, are the main stronghold of the Federalist Party and the nationalist movement. Um, we'll see a separation and diversity of the regions. We'll see that the economic development that takes place in the United States does so in a very disproportionate way. Um, we'll see trade policy and the fact that the northern states uh, favor a protectionist trade policy that protects and fosters and cultivates the American manufacturing sector, and the southern states favor free trade because their primary source of income is going to be exports of their primary products. We'll then take a look also at Jacksonian politics and how Jacksonian politics works in the last part of this epic. And we'll see what a colorful character Andrew Jackson is. Horrible president, very colorful character. Um, we'll also see as one of the political trends international relations. What we're going to see early on, anyways, through the 1790s. And really the first decade of the 19th century is we're going to see rising tensions with Great Britain. We've talked about them a little bit already. Both sides to the Treaty of Paris, which ends the revolution, both sides claim the other side has abrogated the treaty, hasn't abided by the conditions. As a result, the British will stay in the Northwest. While they're staying in the Northwest, and what we mean by, of course, the Northwest here is the area of Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. They'll call not they'll sponsor the Native Americans in the area, the Miami Confederacy, principally in opposition to the United States, and so tensions will continue there. And we'll see the war with the Miami Confederacy that kind of epitomizes this. This epic will lead us all the way up to the Mexican War of 1848, and perhaps most importantly, during this period in terms of international relations, we'll see the enunciation of the Monroe Doctrine, which is the first foreign policy statement in American history. It will be an executive director, an executive statement from James Monroe, the last of the Republican presidents. And we'll look at the details of that. The details of the Monroe Doctrine sometimes get forgotten. And we'll watch the development. And of course, we'll go into it at great length when we get there, but we'll watch the development of this idea of manifest destiny, that it is the destiny, that it is almost a divine right for the United States to spread across the continent and dominate North America. In addition to the Miami Confederacy War, which I just mentioned, we'll also see Black Hawk's War, and finally, and perhaps most egregiously, we'll see Jackson's Indian removal policy. Jackson in 1830 will issue a policy that all natives are to be moved west of the Mississippi River, and we'll see how that works. We'll also see the largest land acquisition by the United States in U.S. history, with the Louisiana Purchase, which they'll buy from Napoleon Bonaparte, in an effort. It's part of Napoleon's efforts to pull the United States into the war against Britain. And we'll also discuss very briefly the Lewis and Clark expeditions, which ostensibly are designed to scout out and map the remainder of the North American continent for the United States. Economically, we'll see an absolute revolutionary shift throughout the period, but especially in this early period, we're going to see the development of American industry. We're going to see what ultimately, in economic terms, is a shift in comparative advantage of the United States. Okay, what we're going to see is a de-emphasization, a de-emphasis on agriculture and primary products, and the development of a nascent manufacturing sector, which will be focused in the New England area. And to support this, we're going to see the development. We're going to see this, what we say here, the transportation revolution. We're going to see the development of a vast infrastructure system. And one of the things I mention and that we'll focus on is the idea that this development of the infrastructure system is very disproportionate. The vast majority of the infrastructure development is going to take place in the North, which will ultimately be the states that are in the Union during the war between the states. And this will help tremendously when the war begins, in terms of logistical support for the Union troops. So, for example, we'll see the development of the Erie Canal, which will be completed in the 1820s and 1830s. And we'll see this idea that actually is originated with Henry Clay. Um, and it will be an expansion. Remember what we started with here was the idea of the subordination of state sovereignty to national sovereignty. One of the things we're going to be looking for is expansions of national sovereignty, expansions of the jurisdiction of the national government. One of the things we're going to see with that is the development of what Henry Clay refers to as the American system, which is government cultivation, government sponsorship, and investment in infrastructure development and in the support of industry. Uh, to that end, we'll see one of the more interesting things is William Fulton first puts a steamboat in the water in 1810. In 1811, the United States has one steamboat with a 400-ton displacement. And by 1848, the end of our epic here, at the time of the Mexican cession, there will be 666 steamboats operating on American rivers with 133,400 tons of displacement. So there's just an absolute mushrooming of this kind of infrastructure support. And this data, most of the data that I use in this class comes from Walton and Rockoff, Economic History of the United States. Railroads will be even more, were at least as dramatic as the steamboats and much more significant. In 1830, throughout the entirety of the United States, there will be 23 miles of railroads, so they're really little more than a novelty and an experiment. And by 1850, there will be over 9,000 miles of railroads. About 85% of those will be in the North. Okay. In addition to these economic trends, we'll see economic integration. This will be largely economic integration. When we talk about economic integration, when we talk about building a unified market and integrating economically, there are a number of preconditions. One of them that is going to be pivotal in the development of this economic integration is the transportation revolution. Now, it should be noted that as a result of what I've already said and what we'll talk about later on, this transportation revolution and the infrastructure development is very disproportionate. The vast majority of it takes place in the North, which will be the states that ultimately form the Union, the Union forces in the Civil War. And so as a result, those economies are very integrated. They will not, however, extend as much to the South. And so this integration of economies is really very disjointed. Okay. Now, after the Civil War, which of course is a little beyond our scope, this will spread across the West, and ultimately the United States will become one integrated economy. But right now, you're going to more and more have two separate economies. You're going to have the economy of the South and the economy of the North, and the North will have greater infrastructure development, will have greater industrial development, will have greater transportation development, and the South will kind of lag behind and really become an underdeveloped area economically, which will put them at a tremendous disadvantage during the war between the states. The economic transition I've already kind of mentioned with the movement from agriculture to manufacturing. To do this, we'll see a number of both controversial and pivotal policies enacted by the United States government, by the national government, with the purpose of not really the stated purpose, but at least as an ancillary purpose, to foster the American manufacturing sector, and we'll get into that at great length when we get there. And as I've said, this is going to lead ultimately to the underdevelopment of the South, and we'll take a look. Actually, I think I reserve it for the next epic at a detailed analysis of the economics of slavery and why slavery as a labor system doesn't really coordinate well with a capitalist economic system. And we'll see why that happens in the South and why the South kind of stays underdeveloped. And at least in the early period, we'll see a number of technological advances throughout this period. Perhaps the most significant in the early period is going to be the development of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793, which greatly facilitates the cultivation of cotton. What we're going to see in the 1790s, really as a result of the cotton gin, is we've talked all along from the very beginning about the dominance of tobacco as the economic spine, the economic basis, the backbone of the southern states. We're going to see that change. It's going to change to cotton. Uh, and cotton will be adopted really beginning really in the 1770s and 80s, but after the cotton gin it gets adopted tremendously, and this is actually going to reduce the need for labor. The cotton gin will help to reduce the need for labor, uh, which again will help put the South at a disadvantage because they'll end up being, uh, for reasons that we'll talk about later, overcapitalized with too many slaves. Now here we see, and this is from Walton and Rockoff. We see, and it's not. I apologize for the graphic. I scanned this into the computer from their book. Um, but you can get a basic idea. We run from 1810 to 1860. So over here we have 1810, 20, 30, 40, 50, and 60, which you can't really see. This is the total labor force in thousands of people. So by the end of the period, you have a labor force of 11.1 million. And this is the distribution of that labor force among the sectors. And what we want to point our attention to is construction and manufacturing, and the diminution of it as a percentage um, of agriculture. You can see that by the end of the period, agriculture is something in excess of 50%, whereas beginning in 1830, the manufacturing sector starts at 8.8%, and we can see the precipitous rise in manufacturing, and just as precipitous a rise in transportation and construction. And so the United States is transitioning out of this primary industry, which focuses on agriculture and extraction. And you can see a similar thing happen with mining, and moving into manufacturing. We've talked about the regionalism, and this is gonna become one of the recurring themes as we go through this epic. Okay, and we've talked about this before. The New England states, under the British system of mercantilism, were essentially isolated. They had no cash crop. The Navigation Acts prohibited their development of manufacturing, and so they remained fairly isolated from the remaining colonies. Also within New England, we see a certain ethnic and religious uniformity that is partially the result of them being fairly isolated. The Mid-Atlantic, the Mid-Atlantic colonies, which is to say really everything from New York down ultimately through Maryland, and that the northern part of that Chesapeake region, the English actually comprise less than 40% of the population. The primary population is Dutch and German. This is particularly true by the end of the 18th century. In the South, this is where you have, again, considerable diversity with the African American slaves that comprise ultimately, by the end of the period, about 35% of the population. Throughout the period, there'll be about 35% of the population. This is the reason in the last discussion, in the last epoch, we talked about the great compromise that helped get everybody on board with the U.S. Constitution. And in that, the slave populations counted as 3/5 of a human being for proportional representation in the House of Representatives. This is because without that population, without the slave population, the population of the South would only be 65% what it actually is. And of course, once the slaves are freed after the Civil War, this is going to lead to a very diverse population on a racial basis in the South, and the difficulties with that become the mainstay of the beginning of U.S. history too. Also, what we're going to have in the southern states, which we don't have as much in New England and won't have as much in New England or in the mid-Atlantic states, is an absolute dependency on foreign trade. And so we're going to see how this plays out and how this puts the southern states at a disadvantage, because as foreign demand for their products drops, their economies kind of go in the dumper, which is neither here nor there. And the North doesn't really care about this, except for the fact, and they hadn't really foreseen this, that when the southern economies go in the dumper, they pull the remainder of the economy with them because of the dependency of the banking sector on the southern states. And we'll look at that in great detail later. we're going to shift our focus to the political administration of the Federalists. Now, as I've said, the Federalists are going to favor a strong national government. One of the things I encourage you to read, that we don't read in this class, although probably we should, is the Federalist Papers and their antecedent. And a lot of people, a lot of universities in American government classes will have you read at least portions of the Federalist Papers. But they don't have you read the anti-Federalist Papers, which primarily are authored by Thomas Jefferson. The Federalist Papers make the argument in favor of a stronger national government. Now, here's the first point we want to talk about is under the U.S. Constitution, they create this chief executive office of the presidency. The problem is that the leader, the driving force of this Federalist movement, this nationalist movement, is Alexander Hamilton. There is, however, a problem, and it's a twofold problem. The first is a legalistic problem. Under the U.S. Constitution, Alexander Hamilton is prohibited from being president. He is prohibited from being president because a president has to be a natural-born citizen of the United States. Alexander Hamilton is not. Alexander Hamilton was born on St. Croix Island. Okay, at the time, this was a French possession, and so he was prohibited from ever being president. The second problem is not legalistic. The second one is a charisma problem, what we would call, I guess, an electability problem. As I've mentioned before, Alexander Hamilton was a thoroughly detestable character. He was an elitist to the extreme. Okay, to the point that he had absolutely no appeal whatsoever with the lower classes. In fact, as I've mentioned before, Alexander Hamilton despised the lower classes. The remainder of the Federalists, now one of the things that we want to keep emphasizing is that the framers of the Constitution and the developers of this government and the original Federalists and how they move forward with that are all well-educated, wealthy landholders. They are the American elite. Okay? But even within that elite, you have Madison, you have John Adams, you have some of the others. They have very little interest in the lower classes. They're not particularly sympathetic towards the lower classes, but they don't despise the lower classes. Hamilton literally thought that the lower classes were almost subhuman, that they really didn't count for anything. And so he will exclude them to the greatest amount he can from any influence in the government. Well, this makes him fairly unpopular. And particularly if you're planning on a popular election of some sort with the president, this is going to make Hamilton unelectable. Hamilton needs, essentially, a front man for the Federalist Party. He needs someone that is a charismatic figure, that is popular, and that is electable. Okay? Well, searching through the ranks of the Federalists, there really isn't very many. John Adams has about as much charisma as a dead fish. Okay? He's really not a very charismatic fellow. How he ever wins the presidency is beyond me. It's probably because after Washington decides not to run again, there's really no alternative. Jefferson at that point hadn't brought sufficient political assets online to be able to be elected. And so he'll tap into George Washington. Now, George Washington himself is apolitical. He really has no political position. Okay? Washington really doesn't have that much of an advocacy for a strong national government. But let's remember what we've talked about before with George Washington. George Washington always wanted to be a big somebody. He desperately, a lot of his career, as we've studied it, a lot of it has been about trying to gain the respect of his British counterparts. So for Washington, he's very prideful, arrogant. He wants to be a big somebody. And so when Alexander Hamilton comes to him and says, George, here's what I want you to do. I want you, he recruits him. I want you to be our candidate for presidency, and you'll be the chief executive. George Washington, of course, says, oh, that's wonderful. Finally, someone's going to show me the recognition that I deserve, and I will be the chief executive of the United States. Okay, and of course, he's very charismatic. He's associated with the Revolutionary War, largely through propaganda. Nobody really understands, as we understand now, what his actual war record was like. And so he's a very charismatic figure, and he'll win the presidency. Madison will fulfill his pledge. If you remember when we talked about the development of the Constitution, Madison promised to write a Bill of Rights, and he'll include that in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. We will then have the Judiciary Act of 1789. This is the first of the things I mentioned that will be one of the pivotal things in establishing the primacy of the national government. It will establish the primacy of the national courts and create a circuit court system with 13 federal district courts, which we still have, and 3 circuit courts. These will be effectively appellate courts. What the Judiciary Act is going to establish, among other things, is that the national government, okay, is Trump. The national judiciary is Trump. And so if you do not get satisfaction at a regional judiciary, at the state level or local level, you can appeal your case to the national level. And the national level's decision is going to be paramount. This is why lawyers today search for precedent conditions at the national level, because if there is a precedent to a case at the national level, the subnational levels, the regional levels, can't contradict that. In terms of the economic administration of the Federalists, as we've said, the Federalists favor the strong national government. The main stronghold of the Federalists is going to be New England and the Northeast, and so they'll champion through the Tariff Act of 1789. Now, under the Articles of Confederation that we looked at, such an act would require unanimous consent. It would be a national tax and require unanimous consent. And of course, what we saw as the Articles went through that, the southern states would never go along with that. Well, now there is a roughly even division in the Senate, with the northern states having a small majority, but in the House, they'll have a majority now. And so they'll be able to pass this tariff of 1789 over the objection of the southern states, which they could never do before. Okay, so this is going to be the first time we see kind of the diminution of the minority rights of the southern states. And it's really, I say here, protection of American manufacturing. Yes and no. The Tariff Act of 1789 doesn't really accomplish that. It's a very small tariff. Okay, it's between 5 and 10%. It's less a reason, less established and less effective in promoting American manufacturing, although it has some ancillary benefit at that. It's really not going to be till the Embargo Act that really comes up. It's going to be more to raise revenue. Remember, one of the crises we dealt with in the Articles of Confederation, with which the Articles were utterly incapable of dealing, was this national debt that resulted from the Revolution. Okay, both external and internal. Well, to be able to pay that off, the government's going to need to raise revenue, and there was no way the Articles could do that. The main reason for the tariff of 1789 is going to be to raise revenue. Okay, and in fact, the two principal sources of revenue for the United States government throughout the period that we study, all the way up through Lincoln, are going to be land sales, because all of the territorial acquisitions of the United States, the largest of which we'll look at will be the Louisiana Purchase, all of that land acquisition, that becomes property of the national government of the United States, which they can then sell. What we saw in the in the land ordinance of 1785 was that the government set the price at $1 an acre, and that'll of course vary as time goes on. And this will be true until the passage in 1863 of the Homestead Act, okay, which will change things a little bit, but the primary sources of revenue will be land sales by the government and the collection of tariffs on imports. Okay, they won't, of course, have the income tax. Lincoln will institute an income tax during the Civil War, but it'll go away right after the war. The income tax as we know it today won't be instituted until 1913. Now, in addition, and as a result of the the residual tensions with Britain after the Revolution, James Madison is going to adopt a very anti-British position in foreign policy, and we'll look at this as we go through the international relations of the Federalists. Madison is going to adopt a very anti-British position, such that in the Tariff of 1789, he'll put into that act that British ships will pay double. Okay, this imposes a penalty on Britain that is above and beyond any of the other tariffs, in an effort to hurt Britain's trade in the United States. Now, the effect of this is that it will give New England shipping and the Mid-Atlantic shipping virtual monopolistic control over shipping in the United States, because all the British-owned shipping, the British shipping industry is the largest in the world. And it will all be essentially denied access to the United States because of this double indemnity tariff that's imposed by Madison, by the Federalists, okay? So the British will have a tremendous retardant. They'll be penalized in trying to trade with the United States, and as a result, this will foster the U.S. shipping industry, which is centered in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. In terms of the monetary conditions, now we dealt with this at some length previously, okay? We have a difficulty with the United States being in debt, and this was one of the reasons that the British use as an excuse to abrogate their part of the Treaty of Paris and remain present in the American Northwest, that period of modern-day Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, which will allow them to support the native populations there against the United States and the spread westward by the United States to the Mississippi River. Okay. The problem is that under the treaty, the United States promised to repay its debt. Now, they have foreign debt and internal debt to people like Robert Morris. Hamilton is going to come up with a method for repaying this debt. First and foremost, to be able to repay this debt, you need to increase the revenue of the national government, okay, which we've already seen. The Tariff of 1789 is going to be one step in that direction. We'll ultimately see the direct tax of 1798, which will be another step in that direction. Okay, ultimately the debt is about $52 million, 42 million of them in war securities, meaning bonds. Okay, the foreign portion of the debt will be $12 million. The way that the debt is going to be repaid, now Hamilton is one of the creditors here, and of course his best buddy, Robert Morris, is the main creditor. And the conflict that we looked at under the Articles was this conflict between the debtors, the creditors and the debtors. The creditors wanted to be repaid in the full face value of their loans, but they wanted to be repaid in specie. And this is because the American currency, the colonial script, had become effectively worthless because of the overabundance of it, okay, because of the runaway inflation after the war. And so they refused to accept that currency as repayment. And this led to Shays' Rebellion, and it led to the great controversies that we saw were one of the reasons for the collapse of the Articles of Confederation. Well, Hamilton decides upon an idea that he hits on early on. He hits on this in the 1780s, but he lacks sufficient support to do this. This was the idea when he decided to create the Bank of North America. This was what the Bank of North America was intended to do. Now that the Federalists reign supreme, and he'll be the original Secretary of the Treasury, he's able to do this. Okay? He's going to take the old bonds, the old securities, and exchange them for new ones. They're going to be repaid at full face value, but not immediately. He's going to borrow from the British idea. Okay, he's going to steal the British idea. And let's go over this just one more time. After the French and Indian War, Great Britain was 146 million pounds in debt as a result of the 7 decades of the imperial wars. They had no method of paying that debt back. And so what they decided to do instead was finance the debt. Okay? reissue all of the securities, and rather than paying them off immediately on face value, you pay them interest, okay, based on their face value. In this case, you see 4%. Okay, this will be the first financing of war debt. This will become the standard operating procedure. Okay, and during boom times in the economy, they'll try to pay down that debt a little bit. It won't be until more recently, really the 1960s and 70s, that they just let the debt run continually. This will be the first attempt to finance the debt. Now, what you'll do is you'll pay your 4% interest on the securities. Now, what do we have here? We have $52 million. Just real quickly, what's 4% of that? 520,000 times 4. 520,000 times 4 is what, about 2.1 million, something like in that neighborhood. So that's what you're going to be paying every year. Well, with the tariff and with a modest tax, you could easily pay that. And then in addition, you're going to pay back a certain portion of the principal, not very much, maybe 5% of the principal. So in all, you're going to have 4 or 5 million a year that you're going to pay on this debt, which is a more reasonable debt repayment scheme than trying to pay it off all at once. Okay? Now, the second thing that Hamilton's going to do is that the national government, the federal government, is going to assume all of the war debt. This is problematic, okay? This, first of all, subordinates state finances. We saw that some of the states had assumed some of this war debt and were trying to pay on it. That's going to go away now. This will make the national government and the national treasury the principal financier of debt, okay, which will go to subordinating the states, okay? Now, the second thing is, the other problem is that the southern states don't have a debt. They're going to be forced, as part of this federal union, they're now going to be forced to incur taxes in order to pay back a debt that they did not incur. This debt is primarily from New England and to a lesser degree from the mid-Atlantic colonies. The Southerners will now be forced to help repay that debt, which is going to be a point of great tension with the Southern states, and it's going to further polarize this regionalization between North and South. His second plan to raise revenue will be to put an excise tax on whiskey. This will be the first attempt at taxing alcohol. This will lead to the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, which centers, not surprisingly perhaps, in Western Pennsylvania. Western Pennsylvania, for those of you who haven't been outside of Western Pennsylvania, or for those of you who aren't from Western Pennsylvania has a tradition, a reputation throughout the United States to this day, as being fond of alcohol, let's put it that way, of being hard drinkers, in the more pejorative sense. We in Western Pennsylvania have the reputation of being a collection of drunks. And it's a well-earned reputation, I suppose. But in order to collect this whiskey tax from Western Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania refuses. Now, what you want to imagine here, what you have here, is effectively moonshiners that are producing whiskey, in the woods of Western Pennsylvania, and then selling it. Well, Hamilton's idea is to tax this whiskey, to tax the sale of it and the consumption of it. Western Pennsylvania refuses to pay it. Okay. Now, this is going to be another instance of the subordination of states' rights. Okay. Western Pennsylvania feels that as a sovereign state, they don't have to abide by national tax policy, which, of course, under the Constitution they do. And so Washington will be dispatched with 30. He'll lead them. He'll lead an army of 13,000 men into Western Pennsylvania to collect the tax. And so this is going to be, among other things, if we were to have trivia questions related to the class, this is the first time that the National Army will be called out to quell civil disorder. And when Washington gets to Western Pennsylvania, he finds no one. He's unable to find a single still. He's unable to find a single producer of any whiskey, and so it's a great failure. One of, as we've seen, one of Washington's great many failures. But this will be a great failure, and the whiskey tax will fall apart. Nobody will pay it. It will be utterly and completely ignored. Second thing Hamilton's going to do that's going to try to help with the crisis is he'll create the chartering of the first national bank. It'll be a charter for 20 years. Okay, and I don't know that I've mentioned this before. The United States currently is the only country on the planet. It's the only state on the planet, the only country on the planet that does not have a central bank controlled by the national government. Okay? All other countries have a central bank controlled by the national government. The United States does not. The United States has the Federal Reserve System, and it's a little beyond our scope to discuss how the Federal Reserve System works. Hamilton is going to charter a national bank. Okay, under the Constitution does not specifically give the national government the right to control currency, okay, or the right to create such a national bank. Hamilton's going to do it, and it's for 20 years. It's going to run from 1791 to 1811, and the primary thing for it is to stabilize currency. What we've talked about is in the 1780s, after the Revolution, there is an overabundance of the supply of money. Okay, the states are all issuing their own bonds. As a result, the supply of money is too great and you have massive inflation. That massive inflation forces currency to lose its value, so it becomes progressively difficult to repay debt at face value. To rein that in, the Articles were incapable of doing this, and we saw this as we discussed the Articles, that what they opted for was for the states to voluntarily agree to rein in the supply of money, and most of the states didn't. This will give the national government and the Federalist Party the ability to control the money supply, rein in the money supply, reduce the money supply, and thereby increase the value of currency and make it easier to repay this debt on face value. Furthermore, this national bank will be a lender of last resort. Okay, so among other things, it lays the precedent condition for it to be able to issue loans for infrastructure development, for transportation development, for manufacturing development, etc. That brings us to the direct tax of 1798, and then we'll deal with the remainder of the Federalists in the second period. Okay. Now, the direct tax of 1798, another way of securing revenue, principally to help repay this debt. It will be a tax on land, slaves, and dwellings. So it is a tax on property. Okay, this will be the first attempt at a property tax in U.S. history. It is supported by Hamilton and what become known as the High Federalists. Okay, and already with this, by now, this is now going to be in 1798, okay? Really by the mid-1790s, and even earlier, really the chartering of that first national bank, the Federalist Party is going to split, okay? It's going to end up fragmenting. On the one side, you're going to have Alexander Hamilton and what we call the High Federalists. These are the true elitists. These are the ones who want a strong national government. On the other side, you're going to have first Madison, and later he'll be joined by John Adams, who favor a somewhat stronger national government, but who still insist on a limitation of national government sovereignty. Okay? And we'll see how this debate goes on here in the concluding section of the Federalist Era. The problem with this tax is that it places a disproportionate burden of the tax on the southern states. Because when we add up the value of property, we include slaves as property, and slaves are included in the direct tax of 1798. Okay? Because of this, on paper, the southern colonies have considerably more property holdings, real property holdings, than do the northern states. Therefore, a tax on those property holdings disproportionately burdens the southern states. Because they have more property, they're going to end up having to pay more taxes. Now, this is especially egregious to the southern states because the main reason for this tax is to help Hamilton finance this debt, this national debt that has been subsumed. We talked about just a couple of minutes ago the subsumption of this national debt by the national government. Okay? In order to finance this debt, the government needs to collect revenue. We saw the Tariff Act. Okay, so that's of 1789. That's one of the ways they're going to do it. This is going to be the primary way they're going to do it. The problem with that is the people who are going to be the largest contributors in this tax, who are going to be charged the most in this tax, are people who don't owe any debt. The southern states don't owe debt. In fact, they were running a surplus. And so you're passing a tax that will force them to pay a disproportionate amount of a debt that they themselves do not owe. This will lead to significant difficulties. And we'll pick that up in the second part of 2.1.